The day was gray, with thick clouds draping the sky over the small village cemetery. The air hung heavy, pressing down on the mourners who had gathered, dressed in dark coats and solemn expressions. They stood in a silent half-circle around a simple, unadorned wooden coffin. The scent of freshly turned earth mingled with the fading fragrance of lilies and roses, remnants of a life now at rest. It was the kind of funeral that would usually pass quietly, with respectful nods, gentle sighs, and shared memories of the deceased. Among the mourners was an elderly priest, Father Benedict, who held his prayer book close to his chest. His face, usually calm and welcoming, was etched with worry. His eyes darted from the coffin to the mourners, then to the small silent figure that had stationed itself at the edge of the gathering. It was a dog, a scruffy mutt with deep brown eyes and a mix of black and gray fur. The dog's name was Rufus, and he was known throughout the village as the constant companion of Mr. Edward Langston, the man now resting in the coffin. Edward Langston had been a quiet soul, a retired clockmaker who had lived in the village for as long as anyone could remember. He was a reserved man, rarely engaging in conversation beyond polite greetings, but his presence had always been a comforting one. Edward's passing had come suddenly, leaving a gap that the villagers felt in the air they breathed and the spaces they shared. And now, Rufus, his only true companion, was alone in the world. Rufus had been a familiar sight in the village, always seen padding along beside Edward on his daily walks. They were inseparable, a pair as constant as the rising sun, moving together down the narrow village lanes and across the green fields. The dog's loyalty to Edward was unquestionable. He had been the man's shadow, his silent guardian. Now, as he sat at the edge of the cemetery, his gaze locked on the coffin, Rufus seemed to embody a grief and loyalty that words could never capture. As Father Benedict began the funeral rites, Rufus let out a low, mournful bark. The sound was quiet, yet it cut through the air, reaching the ears of every mourner. Heads turned, and a ripple of whispers spread through the gathering. The priest faltered in his recitation, glancing nervously at Rufus before clearing his throat and continuing. But his voice wavered, the once confident tone replaced by something unsteady, as if Rufus's presence unsettled him. The dog's bark echoed in the silence, a sound that held more than sorrow. It was almost a question, a challenge. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, some looking at Rufus with sympathy, others with discomfort. There was something about the dog's behavior that seemed unnatural, almost as if he were aware of a truth no one else could see. Rufus's bark wasn't merely a cry of loss, it was a declaration, a reminder that something lay hidden beneath the surface of this quiet ceremony. Father Benedict continued his eulogy, his eyes darting toward the dog with a mixture of guilt and anxiety. The villagers sensed his discomfort, and the more observant among them noted the tremor in his hands, the way his gaze lingered on the coffin as if it held a secret he was desperate to keep hidden. Rufus, meanwhile, had not moved. His eyes remained fixed on the coffin, his body tense, his ears perked up as though he were listening to something beyond the priest's words. As the priest neared the final rites, Rufus let out another bark, this time louder, sharper, filled with urgency. The sound sliced through the air, commanding the attention of every person present. Father Benedict's face grew pale, his fingers tightening around his prayer book. He glanced at the coffin, then back at Rufus, his expression one of dread. It was as if he feared that the dog's bark was more than just a sound. It was an accusation, a call to reveal something hidden. A murmur ran through the crowd as the mourners began to whisper amongst themselves, the tension building with each passing second. Some looked at Rufus with pity, assuming he was simply mourning his master, but others began to feel a strange sense of unease, as though the dog's behavior was a warning, a signal that there was more to this day than a simple goodbye. Rufus's eyes never left the coffin. His stance was unwavering, his gaze intense, almost as if he were guarding something. The villagers could see that he was not just a grieving pet, he was a sentinel, a watchful presence determined to protect his master's memory. Father Benedict's voice grew quieter, his words almost a whisper, and his eyes refused to meet the dog's, as if he feared what might happen if he did. As the ceremony drew to a close, Rufus let out one final bark, a sound that was almost defiant, as though he were challenging anyone to disturb the peace of his master's final resting place. The priest's hands trembled as he attempted to lead the final prayer, his voice barely audible, his gaze fixed on the ground. The mourners sensed the priest's discomfort, and a palpable sense of mystery filled the air, casting a shadow over the solemn occasion. The dog's behavior, the priest's nervous glances, the heavy silence that seemed to settle over the cemetery, all of it pointed to a truth that lay just beyond the grasp of understanding. Rufus knew something, that much was clear, and his presence was a reminder that the story was far from over. As the mourners began to disperse, Rufus remained by the coffin, his posture resolute. The priest lingered, watching the dog with a look of fear, as though he anticipated something he couldn't control. In that moment, it became clear to everyone present that this was not simply a farewell, but the beginning of a mystery that would leave the village questioning everything they thought they knew about Edward Langston and the loyal dog who refused to leave his side. As the crowd slowly departed, the cemetery grew quiet, leaving only the still presence of Rufus and the distant figure of Father Benedict. Rufus remained by the coffin, unmoving, his eyes locked on the mound of freshly turned earth. The few who glanced back felt an eerie chill as they observed the dog's unwavering stance, his loyalty a silent testament to the bond he shared with Edward Langston. But there was something more, something about the dog's posture and intense gaze that unsettled those who saw him. It was as though Rufus were guarding a secret that lay buried just beneath the surface. Father Benedict lingered near the cemetery gate, casting anxious glances back at Rufus. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he clutched his prayer book to his chest. Since the funeral, the priest had seemed visibly altered, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a shadow of guilt and unease. He looked as though he wanted to approach Rufus, but couldn't bring himself to do it, as if fearing that the dog's presence might force him to confront something he was trying to bury. As the last of the mourners disappeared down the path, the priest took a tentative step toward the grave, his gaze never leaving Rufus. But the dog, sensing the movement, turned his head slightly, fixing the priest with a piercing stare that seemed to hold a silent accusation. Father Benedict stopped in his tracks, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and remorse. He quickly averted his gaze and hurried away, leaving the cemetery in a near panic, his steps echoing against the cold stones. That night, the village was alive with quiet speculation. News of Rufus's strange behavior had spread quickly, stirring up questions and rumors that grew with each retelling. Some dismissed the dog's actions as simple grief, the instinctive loyalty of a pet who didn't understand death. But others saw something more, a darkness that seemed to cling to both the priest and the cemetery. They spoke in hushed tones about the priest's nervous glances, his faltering voice, and the palpable tension that had overshadowed the entire ceremony. In the days that followed, Rufus remained by the grave, refusing to leave even as the weather grew colder and rain began to fall. He sat with a quiet determination, his gaze fixed on the grave as though he were waiting for something, or perhaps protecting something. Villagers passed by on their way to work or while visiting the graves of their own loved ones. Some tried to coax him away, offering scraps of food or kind words, but Rufus paid them no mind. He was a sentinel, a guardian bound by loyalty, and nothing would sway him from his post. Father Benedict, meanwhile, became increasingly reclusive. He stopped attending village gatherings, and his sermons, once filled with warmth and conviction, now held an edge of desperation. His eyes, once soft and understanding, were now clouded with guilt. He avoided the cemetery entirely, crossing himself whenever he passed it, as if fearing that Rufus's presence might unearth something he wanted left undisturbed. People noticed his change and their suspicions grew, though no one dared to confront him directly. One evening, a small group of villagers gathered at the local inn, their conversation turning inevitably to the mystery surrounding Edward Langston's death and Rufus's unbroken vigil. They spoke of Edward's quiet life, his friendship with Rufus, and the way he had spent his days working alone in his small clock shop. Edward had never married, nor had he any known family, and Rufus had been his only companion. But now, with Edward gone and the priest acting so strangely, they began to wonder if there was more to the story than anyone knew. "There was something off about the funeral," remarked an older man, his voice low. The way Father Benedict looked at the dog, it was as if he were hiding something. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, and a woman leaned in, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Maybe Rufus knows something. Maybe he's waiting for a reason." The words lingered in the air, casting a pall over the gathering. Each person felt an unspoken chill, as though they were teetering on the edge of a mystery that defied explanation. They had all witnessed Rufus's loyalty, the fierce devotion that bound him to Edward even in death. But what if Rufus was more than a grieving dog? What if he was guarding a secret, a truth that no one wanted to face? Meanwhile, back at the cemetery, Rufus lay quietly by the grave, his head resting on his paws. Night had fallen, and a thick fog drifted across the headstones, casting strange, shifting shadows in the pale moonlight. But Rufus was unperturbed. His eyes remained watchful, his ears alert to every sound. In his heart, he felt the weight of his duty, a duty that went beyond the ordinary bond between man and dog. He was more than a companion. He was a witness to a hidden story, a keeper of something precious that had to be guarded. As midnight approached, a lone figure appeared at the edge of the cemetery. Father Benedict, his face barely visible in the fog, walked hesitantly toward the grave. His steps were slow and uncertain, as if each step took a toll on his spirit. Rufus lifted his head, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the priest. A low growl escaped his throat, a sound that broke the silence of the cemetery like a blade. The priest stopped, his face pale in the moonlight, his hands clutching his prayer book as though it might protect him from the judgment in Rufus's gaze. They stood locked in a silent confrontation, the priest's eyes filled with fear, Rufus's with unyielding loyalty. Finally, Father Benedict whispered, "Forgive me," his voice barely audible, laced with sorrow and regret. He turned and fled, his footsteps fading into the distance as he disappeared into the fog. The next morning, the villagers found Rufus still at the grave, his body still, his eyes unbroken. Father Benedict was nowhere to be seen, and questions began to circulate once more. The people sensed that something dark lay hidden beneath the surface, a mystery that refused to fade. And as they looked into Rufus's eyes, they saw a depth that suggested he understood far more than he should. Days turned into weeks, but Rufus's vigil by Edward Langston's grave never faltered. He remained at his post through cold rains and chilling winds, his gaze fixed upon the grave as though he were waiting for something, or guarding it. The villagers grew used to the sight of him, though the dog's persistence, paired with Father Benedict's absence, left many with a feeling of unease. There was a palpable sense that something remained unfinished, a dark undertone that lingered over the cemetery like a shadow. In Edward's quiet home, Lila, a young woman who had been one of Edward's few friends, began sorting through his belongings. Edward had trusted her, confiding in her more than he had anyone else in the village. Lila had always admired his quiet wisdom, his patience, and the meticulous care he put into every clock he crafted. But as she went through his home, she began to realize that there were pieces of Edward's life she hadn't known, details that hinted at something deeper and more complex. While cleaning one evening, Lila found a small, weathered box hidden at the back of a drawer. The box was locked, and no key appeared to be anywhere in sight. Driven by a sense of curiosity and an inexplicable feeling that this box might hold answers, she decided to take it to the cemetery. She had seen Rufus's devotion and sensed that the dog might somehow understand her purpose. In her heart, Lila felt a strange connection to the dog's loyalty, as though he were guiding her to uncover a part of Edward's past that had been left behind. The cemetery was quiet as she approached, carrying the box in her arms. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the graves. Rufus lifted his head as she neared, his deep brown eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. She knelt beside him, holding out the box, almost as if seeking his permission. The dog's gaze softened, and he gently nudged the box with his nose, as though acknowledging her decision to bring it there. Lila sat beside Rufus, feeling a strange sense of peace. She spoke to him softly, telling him about Edward, about the memories she shared with him, and the impact he had on her life. As she spoke, Rufus remained still, his eyes never leaving hers. It was as if he were absorbing her words, understanding every sentiment she shared. As night fell, Lila decided to leave the box by Edward's grave, hoping that whatever secrets it contained would remain safe there, preserved by Rufus's watchful presence. She whispered a quiet prayer, asking for peace for Edward's soul and for guidance to understand the mystery that seemed to haunt the village. Rufus lay beside the box, his gaze returning to the grave, his posture one of quiet resolve. In the days that followed, Lila became a regular visitor at the cemetery, bringing food and water for Rufus and sitting with him as he continued his vigil. She noticed that he was more at ease when she was there, his tense posture relaxing as he seemed to find comfort in her presence. Their bond deepened, built on a shared understanding of grief and the silent weight of unsaid words. Lila found herself speaking to Rufus as though he were a confidant, sharing her own memories, her own fears, and Rufus seemed to respond in his own way, offering a quiet companionship that brought her solace. One evening, as Lila sat by Rufus's side, she noticed something unusual. There, beneath the soil near Edward's grave, the earth seemed slightly raised, as if something lay buried there. Her heart quickened as she glanced at Rufus, who watched her intently, his gaze unwavering. A chill crept over her as she considered the possibility that perhaps there was more to Edward's grave than anyone knew. Compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity, Lila returned to the cemetery that night with a small trowel. The fog hung low, casting ghostly shapes across the gravestones, but Lila felt a determination she couldn't explain. Rufus watched her closely, his eyes filled with a silent encouragement, as though he understood what she was about to do. As she began to dig, her hands shook with each scoop of soil. Finally, her trowel struck something solid, She froze, her breath catching as she realized she had uncovered a second box, one that appeared older, more worn than the one she'd found in Edward's home. With trembling hands, she lifted it from the ground, brushing away the dirt that clung to its surface. Inside lay a collection of items: photographs, letters, small trinkets that spoke of a life she hadn't known. Lila's heart pounded as she sifted through them, piecing together fragments of Edward's history that she had never imagined. The final item was a letter, its edges yellowed and frayed. As she read, her hands trembled, her mind racing as she began to understand the significance of what she had found. The letter was a confession, written by Edward himself, detailing events that had taken place long ago. He spoke of a friendship with Father Benedict, a bond that had been tested by a terrible choice. The words were filled with regret, with sorrow, as Edward described the guilt that had haunted him for years. Lila realized that this was the weight Edward had carried, a secret buried in his heart, one that Rufus seemed to guard even in his absence. As Lila read, the pieces of the mystery began to fit together. The priest's fear, Rufus's loyalty, the eerie feeling that had blanketed the village since Edward's passing, all of it pointed to a hidden truth. Edward had left behind more than just clocks and memories. He had left a legacy of guilt, a burden that Rufus had taken upon himself to protect. With tears in her eyes, Lila placed the letter back in the box and looked at Rufus. She understood now why he had remained by Edward's grave, why his vigil had been so unbreakable. He had been guarding not just a grave, but a secret, a story that needed to be acknowledged and remembered. She placed her hand on Rufus's head, whispering words of gratitude, of respect, knowing that he had kept his promise to Edward even in death. As she reburied the box, Lila felt a sense of closure settle over her, a peace she hadn't known she needed. She looked at Rufus, who seemed to relax, his tense posture softening as though he too had been released from a burden. They sat together in silence, their vigil complete, their shared duty fulfilled. The next morning, the villagers found Lila and Rufus sitting quietly by Edward's grave, their faces peaceful. The story of Edward's life, of the priest's guilt, of the bond between a man and his dog, would remain hidden within the quiet whispers of the cemetery. And as the sun rose over the graves, casting light over a story that had been laid to rest, Lila knew that Rufus had finally found the peace he had been waiting for. As the days passed, Rufus seemed to settle into a new routine. With Lila visiting regularly and the secret now safely returned to the earth, his once rigid posture softened. He would follow Lila home some evenings, curling up by her door until morning, though he never wandered far from Edward's resting place. The villagers, once uneasy about his presence, now greeted him with a quiet respect, their initial suspicions having transformed into admiration. Rufus had become a symbol of loyalty, his devotion an unspoken legend that spread through the town. Lila felt a quiet pride each time she saw Rufus waiting for her at the cemetery, his calm gaze reflecting a newfound peace. They had shared a journey, uncovering not only Edward's secret, but also a deeper understanding of the village's history, its shadows, and the hidden burdens carried by those who lived within it. She had come to the village for solace after her own losses, and in Rufus she had found a kindred spirit, a companion who understood the weight of grief and the need for silent guardianship. One afternoon, Lila encountered an elderly woman named Margaret while walking with Rufus. Margaret had lived in the village all her life, and her eyes held a wisdom that came from years of observation and a deep understanding of the town's hidden stories. She glanced at Rufus, nodding thoughtfully before speaking in a low voice. "Edward was a good man," Margaret began, her tone somber, "but everyone carries their own secrets. He had a bond with Father Benedict that went beyond friendship, beyond simple companionship. They shared a burden, something that neither could fully let go. Lila listened intently, piecing together Margaret's words with what she had learned from Edward's letter. It seemed that Edward and Father Benedict had been tied together by more than just their roles in the community. They had shared a dark chapter of the village's past, a moment that had altered the course of their lives and set Rufus on his path of guardianship. As Margaret continued, Lila sensed that the old woman knew more than she was willing to share, that she understood the weight of Edward's confession and the reason behind Rufus's vigil. Margaret paused, casting a long look at Rufus before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. Some bonds are forged in the quiet shadows of shared burdens. It's not our place to judge what Edward did or the choices he made, but it is our duty to remember, to honor the loyalty that kept him here, and to respect the dog who has remained by his side, even after death. The words resonated with Lila. She realized that she and Rufus were now keepers of this legacy, bound by a promise made in silence. Though the details of Edward's secret were known only to her, the essence of his story had taken root in the village, a tale of friendship, loyalty, and redemption. As the sun began to set, Lila walked with Rufus back to the cemetery, her heart heavy yet at peace. She knelt by Edward's grave, speaking softly, sharing her gratitude for the lessons he had left behind. She acknowledged Rufus's duty, the silent watch that had guarded a secret, buried not only in the ground, but in the hearts of those who knew him. In the weeks that followed, the story of Rufus and Edward became a quiet legend among the villagers. Parents shared it with their children, not as a tale of fear, but as a story of loyalty and the strength of unseen bonds. People visited Edward's grave more often, leaving flowers or small tokens as symbols of respect. Rufus became something of a village guardian, his presence a reminder of the stories that lay beneath the surface of everyday life. Lila's bond with Rufus deepened, each day bringing a new layer of understanding and mutual trust. She found herself sharing her own secrets, her own regrets, as if Rufus were not merely a companion but a keeper of the truths she had carried alone. Their friendship became a source of healing, a connection that taught her about resilience and the quiet strength found in companionship. One evening, as Lila and Rufus walked through the village, a young child approached, wide-eyed and curious. "Is Rufus still guarding the grave?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent wonder. Lila smiled, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "Rufus is still watching over Edward, but in a different way now. He doesn't have to guard the grave anymore. He's found peace, just like Edward." The child nodded, satisfied, and scampered off, leaving Lila with a sense of contentment. She realized that Rufus's story would continue, woven into the fabric of the village's collective memory, a quiet reminder of the enduring bonds that define us. As the seasons changed and the leaves turned gold, Lila and Rufus's walks became part of the village's rhythm, a familiar sight that brought a sense of comfort to those who saw them. The cemetery, once a place of unease, had become a space of reflection and reverence. People would visit Edward's grave with a newfound respect, understanding that the grave was more than just a resting place. It was the symbol of a bond that had transcended life and death. One evening, Lila sat by the fire, the memories of her journey with Rufus filling her heart. She felt a sense of closure, a quiet gratitude for the lessons she had learned through her friendship with the loyal dog. In Rufus, she had found a guide, a guardian, someone who had taught her about loyalty, forgiveness, and the courage it took to carry a burden in silence. When the time finally came for Rufus to pass, Lila laid him to rest beside Edward, honoring the friendship and the promise that had bound them together. She planted a small tree over their graves, a symbol of life and renewal, a tribute to the loyalty that had defined Rufus's life. As the years went by, the tree grew, its branches reaching toward the sky, its roots intertwined with the memories of two souls who had shared a silent bond. The villagers spoke of the tree with reverence, sharing stories of Rufus and Edward with the new generations. Children would play beneath its branches, their laughter a testament to the joy that had once filled Edward's life. And in the quiet shade of the tree, those who remembered would find comfort, a reminder of the strength found in loyalty and the courage to carry secrets untold. Lila remained in the village, her life forever shaped by the friendship she had shared with Rufus. She became a storyteller, sharing tales of the village's past, of the bond between a man and his dog, of the legacy that had been left behind. In her heart, she knew that she and Rufus had fulfilled a purpose, that they had honored Edward's memory in a way that words could never capture. And as the years passed, the tree stood tall, a silent guardian over the graves of Edward and Rufus, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching for the heavens. It became a living testament to the power of loyalty, a reminder of the unbreakable bond that had brought peace to both man and dog. As the years passed, the tree over Edward and Rufus's graves became a beloved landmark in the village. Its branches stretched high into the sky, its roots anchored firmly in the soil, intertwining with the memories of those it watched over. Villagers came to regard the tree with reverence, a living tribute to a tale of loyalty, friendship, and the quiet resilience that had defined both Edward and Rufus's lives. Children played beneath its branches, while the elderly would sit nearby, sharing stories of the past with knowing smiles and gentle laughs. Lila, now considered one of the village's elders, often found herself drawn to the tree. She would sit beneath its shade, her thoughts drifting back to the journey she had shared with Rufus. The years had softened her memories, filling them with warmth rather than sorrow. She would close her eyes and remember the scruffy dog who had taught her about loyalty and the quiet strength found in keeping promises, even after death. One crisp autumn morning, Lila found herself approached by a young couple who had recently moved to the village. They carried a child in their arms, a little boy with wide, curious eyes who pointed eagerly at the tree. The parents asked her about the story they had heard, of the loyal dog, of the secret he guarded, and the tree that had grown over his resting place. Lila smiled, feeling a familiar warmth fill her heart as she began to share the tale. Rufus wasn't just a dog, she began, her voice soft but steady. He was Edward's best friend, his constant companion. When Edward passed, Rufus stayed by his side, watching over him even when everyone else had left. There was something that kept Rufus there, a duty he carried, a promise only he understood. As she spoke, the couple listened with rapt attention, the child gazing up at her with awe. Lila told them of the bond between Edward and Rufus, of the mysteries left buried, and of the dog's unbreakable loyalty. She described the night she had uncovered the letter, the secret that Edward had taken to his grave, and the peace that had finally settled over Rufus when their vigil was complete. Sometimes love goes beyond what we can see, Lila concluded, glancing up at the tree's branches as they swayed in the breeze. And loyalty, true loyalty, doesn't fade, even after life has moved on. That's what Rufus taught us, that some bonds are forever. The family thanked her, their expressions thoughtful as they continued on their way. Lila watched them go, her heart lightened by the knowledge that the story of Edward and Rufus would live on, passed from one generation to the next. She knew that the tale would grow and evolve, becoming part of the village's fabric. A story told by firelight and in whispered conversations beneath the tree's branches. In the quiet moments, Lila would often find herself speaking to Rufus in her heart, thanking him for the lessons he had imparted, for the friendship they had shared. She felt that he was still there, a gentle presence, watching over her as he had once watched over Edward. And each time she felt his presence, a quiet strength would fill her, a reminder of the courage it took to guard